Jim Harries. Jim is the chairperson of the Alliance for Vulnerable Vision. He is located in Kenya. I've gotten to know Jim a little bit over these last couple of days. He was able to come worship with us in our church on Sunday. It's actually the kickoff of our missions conference in my church, so it was particularly appropriate. But Jim actually studied agriculture for his undergraduate degree, and then went back for an MA in international development, and then finally did his PhD in theological studies, if I remember correctly. Is that right? Mm-hmm. So he is from England originally. He's in Kenya right now. I'll let him tell you a little bit more about himself. Jim, thank you so much for being with us today, and welcome.
Thank you, David. So thank you very much indeed to David for arranging this, and to everyone who's turned up here for this time together. It's a privilege to be here. I've heard lots of good things about Eastern University. Now I want to find out if they're true. So far so good.
Oh good, that's what we like to hear.
So yeah, thank you for that brief introduction, and I'll say more with the slides I want to look at shortly. I am on a trip, so I started in Germany, UK, Canada, USA, trying to inform folks about vulnerable mission that you see written up here. So it's great to be with you here doing that today. I've laid out a number of articles on the side there. After we've finished, if you want to browse and pick any up to read, please do so. Articles in various ways related to the issue of vulnerable mission. Are you hearing me okay? Okay, nods at the back, so I guess people are hearing me. Also have sign-up sheets here if you're interested in receiving either the monthly bulletin we put out, which is free over the email, or participating in a listserv discussion on vulnerable mission issues. Now I can pass it on and you can sign up now, or you might want to sign up at the end, or whatever you want to do. And the final comment I wanted to make before starting, I've become aware Eastern is very interested in mission, in development. Now I guess I'm probably a missionary rather than a development worker. But I think the two are very much related, and as you heard, I did a master's in development at one point. So I think you will find, and I hope you'll find, that which I have to share to be of interest and value. And I do hope also that we'll have a lot of time for discussion, and feel free to ask those development questions as well as emissions questions and so forth. So I don't want to speak for too long, so we have that time available. So we go on to presume you went the wrong direction. Okay. Humble pie. I guess the things that I want to share have come to be very important to me. In 22 years of living in Africa, and I'll say more about that shortly, I've felt convicted that I just need to share these things with more folks where I can, because there's a lot of things being done between the West and Africa that perhaps aren't as helpful as they might be. So I do that with humble pie. I mean, there's a lot of things I don't know, but I'll share something which I hope will be of interest to you. I want to start with a reference to what a colleague in England shared with me on one occasion. He's actually a psychiatric nurse. And he told me about a psychiatric ward in a hospital in Northern England. At the time they were looking for nurses, and it was before the economic downturn, so the native Brits weren't really interested in working in a psychiatric ward. The people who applied for the jobs were Africans. So the African nurses were appointed to work in that ward. Now what my colleague told me is that it didn't work because of a vast cultural gap. But although it didn't work, no one could say it didn't work. Nobody could say it didn't work. So there are things happening which are hidden. And there are things happening that academia is not made aware of. So we need to think beyond even the published word. I'm sure you're here because of your concern for the world. And our concern for the world, I assume also, is reflected in the cross. So we believe that Jesus has something to say to the world today. And we believe that Jesus died for the world. And that all people should get to know that message. And we believe that when he left, he didn't leave us without his Holy Spirit. So God's Holy Spirit is with us to guide us, to empower us, to enable us to do the work that he has for us. So just to briefly talk about the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission before going on to other things. In the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission, we believe that some Western missionaries should carry out their task, or their ministry, or a key ministry outside of the West, using local languages and resources. Now you can ask questions later. You might ask, why are we focusing on Western missionaries? Well, because non-Western missionaries are doing that anyway. And we're talking about ministry, not necessarily the living of the ministry. And we're asking that some do their ministry using local resources and local languages. So let's look at some scriptures. I wanted to start in John 6:15. John chapter 6 tells us about the feeding of the 5,000. Obviously a renowned event. And these 5,000 men, and some people say, well, with women and children you're talking maybe 12,000 or whatever, were fed. Then I want us to look at what happens in verse 15. From the NRV it says, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Jesus' experience after feeding 5,000 people was that he had to withdraw. Because following this feeding, the people wanted to make him into a political king, and that was not his plan. Luke 4:3-4. Another renowned passage. After his baptism, Jesus was led into the wilderness. And when in the wilderness, the devil came to tempt him. And he tempted him to follow avenues of ministry that were inappropriate. So the devil said to him, verse 3, if you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread. If you want many followers, feed them. Okay? If you want many followers, feed the people. Could he have fed the people? I believe he could. He could have turned stones into bread. He could have provided food for the people. What was his response? It is written, man does not live on bread alone. The foundation for Jesus' ministry was not going to be on food handouts. Luke 9 verse 3. Jesus was sending out people to do missionary work. He told them, take nothing for the journey. No staff, no bag, no bread, no money, no extra tunic. When Jesus sent missionaries, he said, go with nothing. Why did he do that? What should we understand by that today? And then finally 2 Corinthians 12 verse 10. Which says the following. Sorry, 1 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians 12:10. I've got the wrong Corinthians there. Pardon the little Bible. All my Bibles are taken by children to go to school, so my mother gave me this one when I was in England. The other one I have is Kiswahili, and it might be just difficult to translate in front of people. So it says this, 12:10, 2 Corinthians. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. A missionary, presumably, should delight in his weakness. So that's our look at, a biblical look at resources, and the way the Bible advocates that a missionary should not carry resources. So let's go on to look at language. Again, briefly, I'm not proving things in this time available, but I'm just making some points. Acts 2 verse 8, well-known passage. The Holy Spirit has come upon the people. And then this is what it says. How is it that each of us hears them in his own native language? So when the apostles in Jerusalem at that time began to preach, everyone from all the known world at the time who was gathered in Jerusalem heard them in their own tongue, suggesting that the gospel is to be preached in people's own language. Acts 14:11-13. This is actually the passage I did my master's thesis on. I guess David did mention I also did a master's in biblical interpretation in between other courses. And in Acts 14:8 and following, we have Paul and Barnabas going to Lystra. And when they got to Lystra, they found a man there who'd been crippled since birth, who'd never walked. And the man looked at Paul, and Paul looked at the man, and he saw he had faith, so he said, "In the name of Jesus, you are healed." The fellow who'd never walked got up, started walking around. People in Lystra were amazed. Paul and Barnabas presumably standing aside and watching developments as the people were excited and obviously arranging something. The next thing that Paul and Barnabas saw was someone bringing a cow for slaughter to the gods that had visited their village. In Lystra, Paul and Barnabas did not understand the language that people were using. When they didn't understand the language that people were using, instead of going to take a message about God, Paul and Barnabas were mistaken for being God. And I think that's something that happens often in our day. Not knowing the language, instead of having a message about God, one can be mistaken for being God. Acts 22 verse 2. When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Now this happened when Paul was in Jerusalem in the temple, and he was being cleansed in the temple. But some people then accused him of bringing Gentiles into the inner court that was only for Jews. A riot broke out. The people were determined to kill Paul, but the soldiers came and rescued him before he was slaughtered by the mad crowd. The soldiers carried him onto the steps of the fort. And then he said, "Look, can I talk to the people?" And they said, "Okay, you can." And somehow the people turned their ears to him. And when he spoke in Aramaic, the people were silent. When he spoke to them in their own language, the people now really wanted to hear. So there are a lot of indications in the scriptures that mission work should be done by a missionary traveling without their own resources and using the language of the people being reached. One other passage I wanted to look at, Acts 13:10. In a sense, by the way, but something important to have in mind when considering mission work in Africa is Africa that I'm living and working. Acts 13:10, Saul and Barnabas went onto the island of Cyprus and met a man there called Bar Jesus, who was clearly not in favor with Paul, because this is what Paul says about him. You are a child of the devil and an enemy of everything that is right. You are full of all kinds of deceit and trickery. Will you never stop perverting the right ways of the Lord? Now this man in Greek is described as magos. And there's something about magos that is considered in the scriptures to be inherently wrong. Now what's interesting, of course, is that magos has been appropriated by English, and we have the word magic. And when a word travels from one language to another, it's often interesting to consider why. We also have the Magi, of course, visiting Jesus as he was born, as recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. So, what is this magos that is so bad? And how does it relate to our work in taking the gospel of Jesus Christ around the world? Just to give a bit more of my background, David explained that my undergraduate studies were in agriculture. I loved farming as a young man. As we were training, many preachers would come to our college. We'd invite them to speak to the Christians, and they would challenge us. Are you going to use your agricultural skills to add to European food mountains, or will you go to where food is short? To me, the response was always, I'm not the person to go to the third world. I'm just not equipped, and so forth. And also, in my own mind, either I was going to commit my life or I wasn't going to go at all. I know a lot of people go on short-term visits. To me, that wasn't an option, either life commitment or not at all. Because if you go on a short-term visit, maybe you have 2 months and it's a terrible experience. Does that mean God doesn't want you there? Maybe the next 2 months would have been a wonderful experience. But anyway, in October 87, the Lord told me that he wanted me to commit myself for long-term service. I anticipated at the time that would be in teaching agriculture. So I went to Zambia with a mission, now SIM or SIM, to work at a secondary school teaching agricultural science, and did that for 3 years. While I was there, I had opportunity to move around in that rural African community, and had a good grasp of the language by the final year or two, and tried to find out what was happening. And I was convicted by my finding that the community was bound by witchcraft beliefs. And it was the witchcraft beliefs that were preventing the people from going forward with their agricultural production. Now I can give you an example of that. On one occasion I was talking to a farmer, and at that time I was very interested in farming, so I spent time with farmers, and the farmer showed me the land that he had planted. And then he showed me the total extent of the land that he had. Now in that part of Zambia, as many other parts in Africa, we have a hungry season. A time of the year when there's not enough food. So I said to him, well, you've planted that, why don't you plant more land so that you have food during the hungry season? He said, no, I won't do that. Why not? Well, because if I have food while other people are hungry, then there are two options. Either I share my food with everybody else, and then I don't get any benefit from growing the extra food. Or I keep the food and I eat with my family when everybody else is hungry. And then I will be bewitched. So he carefully restricted the land that he was growing in such a way that the food would run out when the hungry time came, so that when other people were hungry, he also was hungry. So there's an example of how fear of witchcraft beliefs, now witchcraft and envy very much in parallel, prevent African people from growing more food. Anyway, going on from there, I came back to UK, studied development there, and then the door opened to Kenya. Going to Kenya, I had this intention. I wanted to stay close to the people and show love to them. Now, can you show love from a distance? I guess these days many people say you can, because we do. In other words, a lot of development work is done from the West, planned, and then implementation happens over there. Now I was convicted that showing love required staying close to the people. And I'd also realized how easy, from my time in Zambia, it is when a Westerner who has a funny color like me goes into an African community, it's very easy to withdraw. So I decided to follow two principles in order to stay close to the people and to be able to show love to them. The first principle is that I should use the local language in the ministry I was going to do. And the second principle was that I was not going to invest outside money in the ministry I was going to be involved in. So that's what I've been doing in certain ministry for 17 years, and that's what I'm now hoping to share with more people such as today. So since then, in 1993, that's how I've been working. I'll give you more details shortly. A bit of an idea of geography. You can see Kenya here, Uganda, Tanzania in East Africa, and this red blob indicates where I'm located. Next one. Now there's a certain American who comes from my home area. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's called Obama. Now what we know is that Obama means he makes me crooked, because his name comes from the Luo language. But anyway, his home is actually quite near to one of my classes in Karindo. That's the red area you found on the last map, just to give you an idea of my regular routine. My home is here. Mondays I cycle about 20 miles to Karindo on the Monday morning, and Karindo we have a theological class from 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Then I sleep at Karindo, which is actually, we have that class at an indigenous church called Legend Maria. You can ask more later if you want to. Tuesdays, go on another 8 miles to Ndere, where we have a theological class from 10 a.m. to 12 noon. And then I'll make my way to Kima International School of Theology, where I teach Tuesday afternoon till Thursday afternoon. So Thursday, go back home, which is here. And then Friday, I'm teaching a class in Yala. Saturdays and Sundays, I'm in various activities. We have many indigenous churches, many of the churches I'm visiting. We also have many funerals. Funerals is the big event in this part of the world, so go to funerals and so on and so forth. So that's just an idea of the kind of routine I'm engaged in during term time, if you like, when we're not on vacation. So just to say a little bit more about the extension Bible teaching programs. So I'm involved with 3 theological schools. One is Kima International School of Theology, I'll talk about shortly. The other 2 are Yala Theological Center and Siaya Theological Center. Those, Yala and Siaya just being towns, villages in the area. Now in these programs, we offer theological teaching in the indigenous language, either in the Luo or Kiswahili. We have no resources apart from a pile of books like this. There's no office, there's no administration, there's no campus, there's no classroom. So if you think a Bible college is a place with a nice big campus, well, we're not of that ilk. We move on foot, by bicycle, sometimes by bus. A lot of the visiting of churches that I'm doing the weekends is informing people of these classes, inviting them to the classes to participate and so forth. We're oriented to indigenous churches, though we also have Catholics, Anglicans, New Apostolic, Pentecostals. Anybody can come, but we have a special orientation to indigenous churches. So these are the ministries that I'm involved in which local language is what we use, and we're waiting to the time when local people say this is of value to us and we want to support it, rather than bringing outside money to support this activity. Now I'm also 2 days a week at Kima International School of Theology, which is actually across the tribal boundary in another ethnic group called the Luya, which is interesting because it gives a separation to me between those ministries. That wasn't planned, but it has happened that way. So Kima International School of Theology is run by Church of God Anderson, together with Church of God Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania and so forth. We have at the moment about 74 students. We offer a Bachelor of Arts degree and a diploma and a certificate in Bible and Theology. drawing heavily on the accreditation through the Assemblies of God Global University, some of you may be aware of. So our language of instruction here is in English. Now some people ask me, as you'll see later on, I don't have power at home. Well, how do you use a computer? Well, this is where I keep my computer. Okay, so there's electricity here, and I'm teaching part-time here 2 days per week. I have at times been involved in administration, but my preference is to be adjunct faculty in that way. So just to tell you a little of my home. You can see where I'm located there. On one day I decided I wanted a picture of the home, so I rented a helicopter and flew up above the home and took, oh, sorry. You didn't see that, did you? Well, thanks to Google, we don't have to rent helicopters these days. So there's a home I live in. Really what I'm illustrating is it's no different from any other home. In fact, the house I live in was built by a man, and the other house was for his second wife, but he subsequently did what we say in the Lugo Dala. In other words, he moved to his new home, so he abandoned that one, and I was able to go there and take over his homes. Now, I'm single, I'm not married, but I do stay in that part of Kenya with orphan children. So there's some of the children that are staying with me, and the lady you see there is the one who's in charge of looking after those children. Go on to the next slide. So just to say a little bit about that, again, if you want to ask questions later, there's my home from ground level. See, I have two houses. The lower, nearer house is for sleeping for ladies and girls. So we basically live in the upper house, but separate at night for sleeping purposes. In my home and in rearing these children, our home language is the Luo, sometimes Kiswahili. I don't have electricity and I don't have running water at home. My intention being that the children should stay within their community. I think looking after orphan children, you have two options. Either take them out and bring them into your community, or make sure they stay in their community. So if you visited my home, if you didn't see the funny colored white person there, you would not know that there was a European living in this home. So I don't have television, radio, washing machine, running water and so on and so forth. So as to make our home no different from others. Also, there's a lot of thieving in this area. We're near the border with another tribe and they tend to come over and try and steal. So if you don't have a lot of wealth, you don't attract the thieves either. Next one. So that in a sense is a little, by the way, I'm not saying that's vulnerable mission, but I'm filling you in on the way that I live, so that if you want to ask questions you can. I've been looking after children for 14 years on that basis, and many of them have now gone and got married, had their own children, and so on and so forth. So that's been a privilege also to be involved in that activity. Just to say a little bit about indigenous churches. These are churches started by and led by African people. Their formation is various. Sometimes they break away from a mission church like the Anglican Church. Sometimes they just kind of form independently. And sometimes indigenous movements seem to take a church character. So there are a great variety of these. This is one that I was worshipping with, and I climbed up the tree to take this photograph that shows you a few things that are typical on the African scene. The bright clothes, ladies wearing white. Sometimes they call these white robe churches. Also found in West Africa, they're called Aladura. In South Africa they call them Zionists and so forth. So we have outreach to these churches. So here we are at worship in the church. Other characteristics that people associate with African worship: big drums. We also have round cymbals that we knock hard. Worship tends to be lively, and the worshippers very often seeking to be filled by the Spirit. Now when I say the Spirit, if we go on to the next picture, let me talk about that in reference to this which you saw on the front of the man's garment, ARCC, African Roho Christian Church. Now some of you might be asking what is Roho? But Hebrew scholars will know what Ruach is. Ruach being the Hebrew word for wind or spirit in the Old Testament, which simply is found in Arabic, which came through Kiswahili as far as us in Western Kenya to be included in the Luo. So the term that we use in Western Kenya, and much more widely than that, for spirit is Roho. Again, it's interesting, an introduced word, presuming an indigenous word, wasn't so easy to find. In fact, an alternative would have been more equivalent to the English word ghost. And in present practice, the word ghost has largely been done away with. Bible translations don't have Holy Ghost anymore, they have Holy Spirit, because otherwise the implication is that someone has come from the dead and become holy and come to visit us. We have word for ghost in Luoland called Jiachien, and we use Jiachien synonymously with Satan or Satan or the devil. So Roho is very important in much of East Africa. I was once with one of these churches, and the drums were being beaten and the cymbals were being clashed, but the leader of the church felt that the people weren't yet lively enough. So he stood up and said, "More juok, more juok." And then I think embarrassingly he realized I was there and he stopped saying more juok. Now I don't know if it's, I can see a man from Sudan, is it?
Yes.
Are you a Luo?
Luo and my tribe, they have similarity in language.
Is that Dinka?
Yeah. No, I'm from Nuer.
Nuer?
Nuer, yeah.
Okay, juok, jok, I think it's meaningful to you.
Meaningful, yeah.
Is that God or is it spirit?
Spirit, yeah. That's right.
Spirit.
Yeah.
Right. So the Nuer and the Luo of Kenya have a lot of similarities in language and culture. So, more juok. Juok we also translate into English as witchcraft. So I don't know where your interest lies, if you want to ask more on that. What I can perhaps say is that many churches in Africa are countering witchcraft. In the UK, and I guess in America similarly, the church tends to be up against secularism and atheism. Here we're defending ourselves against secularism and trying to make inroads into secularism. In Africa, we're up against witchcraft and ancestral spirits. So we're trying to protect ourselves from spirits and from witches. Next one. Another point to make here. On one occasion I was riding my bicycle up a hill. Well, I wasn't, I was pushing it up the hill, sorry, because it's too big a hill. And someone else, Kenyan, came and was pushing his bicycle up the hill. Of course, a wonderful opportunity for theological engagement when that happens. What he said to me was, you know, everything we have comes from you. Everything we have comes from you. Now, I had to think about that. But what I understand him as saying is largely true. The things that the people in Western Kenya have come from, well, not from me, from the West. They originated in the West. People used to be naked. Sometimes they wear a bit of goat skin to cover the genitals. Everything was, at a material level, very, very simple. But so much is come and is coming from the West. Clothes, radios, mobile phones, education, English, books, bicycles which we were pushing up the hill, bags made out of plastic, whatever it is. African people are very intently looking at the West, because that is where all, very much of what they have is coming from. as illustrated by this picture that just shows people looking at the computer screen. What are the implications of that? If people, instead of considering their own lives and their own communities and their own functioning, are always looking to the outside for advice, guidance, help, money, materials, food, and so on. So just to say a bit more about the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission, and to begin with the question of resources, and to explain some of the reasons. I've given you the scriptures, in addition to the scriptures if you like, why we say that some missionaries should not bring in outside resources. Many years back, I was a member of a committee in Zambia that was arranging outreach to youth in local churches. So this committee would meet 3 or 4 times a year to plan the program. You two that week you'll go there, you two that week you'll go there, and so forth. So we were about 6 of us meeting to plan this program, and as we sat and began to talk, someone said that a missionary has offered our group a bicycle for use in ministry. So then discussion began. Who will use this bicycle? Where will the bicycle be kept? Who will repair the bicycle if it's broken? How will a bicycle be borrowed if someone else has a legitimate use for it? What kind of ministry will the bicycle be used for, and what kind of ministry will it not be used for? Presumably, if this has been given for youth ministry, it can be used for church ministry. Are funerals church ministry? Can we use bicycle for funerals? What happens if it needs repair? Who is going to pay for the repair of the bicycle? 4 hours went by. No plan for youth ministry was made on that occasion, and we didn't finish working out how this bicycle was to be used. Resources that may seem simple can create great difficulties and disrupt programs very easily. As I say, just a few examples. We're going on to widows. There are many widows in my home community, and unlike, well, I'm sure widows are in need wherever they are, but in some places they go to the government and the government gives them money and on they go. But there are other parts of the world where there isn't such provision, and widows can be in very serious need. So let's imagine a widow comes to your door and you're a missionary in Africa, and she tells you her plight. Her husband died 2 years ago and now the child needs school fees and her house is leaking. And you take pity on this widow and you say, okay, take $100. Next day another widow comes to your door and tells you her story, and you listen very carefully and you think this widow isn't as badly off as that widow was, so you say, well, take $20. And then another widow comes to your door and you really don't think she's in such a serious predicament. You say, sorry, I can't help you. Those widows meet and they talk. And she says, he gave me $100. Well, he didn't give me anything. And the one who got nothing starts spreading rumors that Jim is having an affair with this widow. That's why he gave her so much money. And I'm spreading dissent, envy, jealousy and dispute in the community around me by an unequal sharing. And that dissent will drive me out of the community. But how can you share equally? Get a list of all the widows in the village. You then become the chief administrator of the village. You're the boss, you're in charge, you have the power. Does the foreigner always have to have the power? Helping the poor is no easy task. Now another illustration of that, I was struck when a student in one of our classes made a comment to this effect. If you want some money, it's no good saying, excuse me please, would you have a spare $2 that you could lend me? Because the person can say no. So what you have to do is say, give me $2. And then, if you don't give them any option to refuse, they're bound to give it to you. And that culturally is the way we work in Western Kenya. If you want something, you don't say, would you please, could you possibly, or would you mind, or whatever. It's, give me your computer. Yeah, I know, for an American, or at least for a Brit, if you say, give me that, we give it. And then the African people can be incredulous. He gave me his camera. He didn't expect to be given it, but the way we talk is to say, give me. And the appropriate response is to have a laugh, if you like. Now, there's a book here. I don't know if anyone has come across this book. If you haven't, I highly recommend it for those who want to minister in Africa. And others tell me it's also very useful for other parts of the world. African Friends and Money Matters talks about those things. Next one. So then, just to go on to the question of language, how do African people use language differently? Now, this little word, use, I think is very interesting. Because if you talk about meaning of language, it's as if languages can translate one to another. But if you talk about how people use their language, you can actually find vast differences in the way people use their language that translators can totally ignore. Hence the importance of taking the time with the people, learning their language, rooting your ministry in that language so that it's real for that context. African issues cannot be discussed in English. Seems plain to me. But a lot of people are discussing African issues in English. And if you want a degree on understanding Africa, you get it in English. Even though the nuances, if you like, or the implicatures and the all the meanings and so forth are wrong. How can you discuss people's issues in a language that is vastly foreign to their context? Now, here's just an example of language use. And people tell me, when you tell a Westerner what you're going to do, they can believe you. Now, that seems straightforward, I guess. So, I tell you, tomorrow I'm going to come by and visit you at 10 a.m. What do you do? Well, I guess, I mean, I'm not an American, but as a Brit, 5 minutes to 10 you put the kettle on. And then you're sitting there waiting for the person to come at 10 o'clock. And if it reaches 12 o'clock and you haven't seen them, you're disappointed. Well, if it reaches 10 past. Now, quite frankly, in the community I'm in Western Kenya, if someone says, I'm going to visit you at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, it doesn't mean they're going to come at all. And making any preparations is pointless. It just doesn't mean that. It means something like, I would really love to visit you. I appreciate you're the kind of person I would like to see. But it's a different way of using language. And if you think that through English that you've learned in America, you can minister in Africa, maybe you've got some hard lessons coming. So, we're making an appeal for some Western Christians to be on their side. Now, what I've noticed about the UK and America, we get a lot of African people on our side. There seem to be some in this room. We're always saying, come, learn our language, participate in our educational system, look at our problems and our issues, help us so that we can together live better. But where's the Westerner who's going to move to the African side and work with the African people so that they can work on their issues? Very, very few. And if you think you can do it in English, I'm suggesting you're deceiving yourself. So let's help the African people look at their issues as they're helping us with ours. And there are many, many of them helping us with ours, because they're in our universities, and they're addressing our issues. Where are those of us, as Westerners, who are saying, I want to work in Kiswahili, in Dholuo, in Nuer, in order to try and come to terms with and then help people seek solutions to their issues as they perceive them. So let there be some Western missionaries to the non-West whose ministry is carried out using the language and resources of the people being reached. The means by which you can get close to the people. If you are the donor, don't pretend that you're going to get close to the people, because when you ask a question, the answer is yes, because there's money coming. And that is simply a wise answer. If someone is about to give you money, will you do this for me? Yes. Doesn't mean they value what you're doing or giving or proposing. Doesn't mean they like it or going to enjoy it. Try proposing something when you don't have any money, and they'll probably laugh and walk away. So then you have to say, well, what's wrong with my proposal? And work on it until the day comes when they say, what you're proposing is valuable, and they're not saying it because of the money you're about to pull out of your pocket. Linguistically, I've already mentioned a similar thing. How can you talk to people in one world if you're using the language of another world? So that's what I had to share at this time, and now we can move into a time of questions. Thank you very much. Okay.
On your website, I just noticed that your philosophy is that you don't believe in accepting outside funds. I noticed Glenn Schultz is on your board of directors, and he really advocates not accepting outside funds. I was just wondering if you do, and how do you use those outside funds in a way that would be I don't know how do you do that in projects that still has the applicants to take ownership for what they're doing without looking at it as being outside aid? You know
Right. So the question is, for the benefit of the video, how do you go about with outside funds, or what do you do in terms of outside funds, if I simplify a little bit? Let me try and answer that, and then if I haven't got the question, you can come back to me again. And Glenn Schwartz, who heads up World Mission Associates, is very much for countering dependency. I haven't used that term, but it's something we're also very interested in. And it's very easy from the West to make people dependent on you for what they're doing. Now, what we're proposing in the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission is that there be some missionaries who are not a part of that system. Now, perhaps if I can try and answer this way. Let's say David and myself are both going to be going to Sudan as missionaries. And there is $100,000. There are $100,000 available for us to use. Now, typically what would happen is that I would do my fundraising thing, and David would do his, and he'd get $60,000 and I get $40,000 because he's a better fundraiser than me. So I'd have $40,000 to spend and he'd have $60,000 to spend. So what we're proposing in a sense is that the vulnerable missionary says, look David, here's my $40,000 that you can use for your project. So the money's still going to Sudan. If Sudan really is going to benefit from the money, which I'm not sure it will, but I'm not saying stop giving. But what I'm asking is, can there be some missionaries, in this illustration myself, who goes to Sudan without being lumbered with this money that I have to spend on the people, so that I can relate to the people on a level playing field and can be to them as a colleague and not as a donor. Okay? Does that? Now, we have a lot of what Glenn Schwartz says, I think, is great sense. We have just a slightly different approach to that which he's also doing.
And the second part of the question is, so then how do you start projects and use that money where you're not looking like you're, one in power as the donor? How are you working with the community?
Okay. So
how do you empower them to take on the project themselves without all this outside wealth?
Right. How do we work with the community, given that we're not receiving outside funds that we can ourselves be distributing? I guess that raises a question: is there anything that a poor man can do for himself? If the answer is no, we're in trouble. If the answer is yes, what is it? That's what we want to do with him. And I believe the answer is yes. There's nobody who can do nothing unless they're on their deathbed. And it's by ignoring what people can do for themselves and providing the best solutions from outside that has made doing something for yourself as being very unpopular. And in the parts of Africa that I know, it is frankly unpopular. Because if you do something for yourself, it's like you're just saying no to the donor who's about to do it better than you could do it. So so the vulnerable mission I'm talking about is working with the people in the way they work. Now remember also, I might be in a community and David might be putting his $100,000 into the community. It's not that even there's no foreign money there. And if that $100,000 comes and people are using it and I'm benefiting from it, I mean, that's okay, but I'm not going to control it. I'm not there to tell David, don't do this, do that, do the other. So if funds come from elsewhere, they're now local resources. And the vulnerable missionary can work like other people do with local resources accessed in a local way. Okay, I hope that's answered.
I was just wondering if it's not funneled through you and through the African community, like how do you set up accountability for that? Like, you know, how the Africans decide where it's going to go and who needs it.
Right.
And avoid corruption.
Yeah, I mean, if the Africans are receiving the funds, this is about how do you, as I understand it, how do you help the Africans avoid corruption? I mean, you don't. I think the whole donor model is problematic through and through. Extremely problematic. The whole notion that from one part of the world you can develop another part of the world by putting in funds is problematic. But yet I'm not condemning it. In the Alliance for Vulnerable Mission we're saying, okay, do that. What we're saying is, can there be a little space for some Westerners to work other than as donors? And if the donors want to do it, and if it's corrupt, well, they better sort it out, how to uncorrupt it. But can there be some who work not with a prime objective of spreading resources, but with a prime objective of sharing Christ? Now, sharing Christ may be, in my case, Bible teaching. It may be looking after the sick. It may be looking after children. It may be even agriculture. If you can teach agriculture without making people dependent on your money, go for it. Okay? Yes?
Would in fact the opposite be necessary, where you go to teach agriculture, you go to teach theology, whatever, and if you're not receiving any funding from outside, in order to live there, you have to receive funding for them. In other words, you have to charge them for your teaching.
Okay.
It's going to be completely cut off from any outside sources.
Right. So the question is, if you're not connected to outside sources of funds, does that mean you have to be dependent on the local community for your own upkeep? And as I understand, biblically, that's the model that we're given. I read from Luke chapter 9, and the missionaries were told, don't carry any spare food or whatever, go and stay in a home and let them feed you. And if they don't, then leave the dust behind and go on somewhere else. So I think that's the ideal missionary model. Now in Africa today, as I understand, it's very difficult to implement that as a Westerner, because people not only expect you to look after yourself, they also expect a Westerner to be funding everybody else. Now if you go there and say I have no money to do anything, it may be too great a shock on both sides. So we're not advocating that. We're saying if you are a missionary coming from the West and your church is sending you there and keeping you alive, that's fine. But now when you move into ministry, why should you, as a foreigner who frankly knows the least, have all the advantages because you have these powerful people standing behind you, funding everything you do. So when it comes to ministry, our work in the church, can we not in that work be the same as everybody else and use local resources rather than outside resources? Okay? Yes?
Jim, let me ask you this. Are you suggesting then that the greatest lesson to be learned is for people going there, or for Westerners to learn from Africans in the reverse? What are you suggesting with the approach?
Okay, he asked, am I suggesting that the most important thing we have to learn is from Africans? As a Westerner goes to Africa, we need to learn from Africans. On basis of personal experience, if you like, I think yes. My own experience of education in the West is it's very helpful to undo and to make transparent things that I thought were universal. So being brought up in Britain, of course you have to do that, and of course you have to do that, and of course it's like this. And you move to another culture and you find it's not like that. It's very hard to grapple with that, but education has helped me to grapple with it and see where those things have actually come from, and they're not universal. But in terms of working locally, of course the best knowledge is the local knowledge. That's where you need to begin. And once you've got a foundation in the local knowledge, then you can begin to build from there and to move from there. Now also, of course, as a Christian, you're looking to God for your insights. And teaching the scriptures, living the scriptures, being a testimony to Christ needs to be and should be a foundational part of what you're doing. So you keep that there and learn from the people and build from their foundation.
So is it two-way or one-way?
Please explain.
If you're going there and you don't fully understand, and you're coming and you're acknowledging that you don't fully have all the tools and the understanding
Right.
to go in and teach and impart your knowledge. So we're saying that.
Okay.
But on the flip side, we're also saying that there's some things that need to happen here in the United States in terms of, and I'm just using the United States as an example, but in terms of what we could learn
Right.
from how things are done over there.
Yeah.
So is it one way or is it a two-way
Right.
chance for that to happen?
Now what I'm hearing from you, you're asking, do we have things to learn in the United States from what is happening there? Or, because I'm not actually saying that we have things that they need to know, because I'm saying you need to learn things there. Now, the most valuable thing we have to share is our faith. Our faith put into action. I'm not talking about some faith like in hanging in the air. Live your faith. What do I mean by your faith? Read the scriptures. There's lots of it there, you know. I'm not going to start expounding the whole scriptures. Live as a believer. And that's the most valuable thing you have to share. Of course, morality, sacrificing yourself, love, and so on and so forth. We always have things to learn from one another. On the other hand, I don't go back to the UK saying to the British people, listen, I've learned this from Africa, you must change. Now implicitly I've changed and my thinking has changed, but that cultural divide is a difficult one to cross. Things don't just move, they get transformed in the process. So there's an implicit process of learning from one another, but in a sense it perhaps needs to remain implicit rather than explicit. If I had 10 things that you have to change in Eastern University because you do different in Africa, I'm not sure that I could put that together. Yeah? Yes?
You just said you feel like the most important thing that we can share is our faith. I mean, if moving to Africa, but would you agree that our faith and our culture are very closely tied? And I'm just curious, I feel like I can make this division between Western faith, the Christian culture that we have here, as opposed to African Christianity,
Right.
and faith that is indigenously developed there, is there a conflict when we bring our Western faith, African faith, I mean, you already mentioned witchcraft and things like that, and how we see that as a very negative, the spirit is a very negative thing, but when there's a blending of that in African cultures, is that, I guess I'm trying to wonder, is that sometimes detrimental when you're bringing your Western faith?
Right. Thank you. The question is asking if you come with your Western faith. Now, as I understand the question, how can you implement that Western faith in the context which is very different to where that Western faith was developed? For example, in Africa you have concerns with spirits and witchcraft that the person quite likely has not had to think about before. Now, what I'm proposing is that the problem in the transfer of faith arises when you want to do it in your language and with your money. Because then you are forcing your faith onto people. But I think the most wonderful thing you can do is to live your faith from that position of vulnerability. Now, you may be talking nonsense at the beginning, but no one's going to mind if they see how committed you are to God and how much love you have for the people. You'll talk nonsense, and gradually you'll learn that you're talking nonsense, and you'll learn to better what you're saying and doing. So the problem often, as I would perceive it, is not that the American has this terrible faith they shouldn't tell Africa, but they shouldn't tell it with force. Go in the village. Well, if you have to do it in their language, you're a little child. You're worse than a little child. Good. Take the position as a little child. Be faithful to God. Show love. Show commitment. Commitment particularly. Unfortunately, short-term mission doesn't give that opportunity. It's easy for a few months to really be a good Christian, but are you going to continue being a good Christian for 5 years and 10 years and 15 years is a question in people's minds. And that's the difficulty. So one's faith and one's understanding of faith enculturates itself if one is sufficiently vulnerable to the context one is meeting. Yeah?
I'll follow up with one more question on that.
Okay.
Is there a reason why you don't advocate that all Western missionaries do this? In your mission statement, you keep saying some Christians
Right.
do this.
He's asking, is there some reason that I don't advocate that all Western missionaries take up vulnerable mission? People often ask that question, and I'm always surprised by the question, because who am I to start to say every missionary in the world change and do it this way? I mean, I'm one person, and I've been very much touched through my ministry to share this, and I'm asking for some. Now, 6 or 15, so I don't think I need to say, everybody stop and change, if they haven't even given room for the 6 or the 15. So can we leave room for a few to operate in this way? When I say leave room, in many mission contexts, there's a lot of pressure, especially, for example, in administration. In Africa, administering the Bible school takes a lot of effort and a lot of money and a lot of manpower. So there's pressure to bring everybody into the administration, every missionary. And then we're saying, well, can this missionary be left to minister in this vulnerable way, even though there's all this high pressure at the Bible school? And of course, the person left to work in a vulnerable way can seem to be non-productive. Everyone else is busy on the computer raising funds, doing this and struggling to meet deadlines, and he's probably sitting in the village and chatting to folks, or going to funerals, or going to indigenous churches and just trying to pick up the language. But what we're saying is that does have a role, and it's important that those involved in the other kind of mission are supportive to these people. Because if they're not, if they say you're no good for nothing, then where's love? We've got to love each other. So a vulnerable missionary's got to love the person who's the donor, and the donor's got to love the person who's a vulnerable missionary and respect him or her in her role or his role. Yeah.
You talk about not bringing in outside resources. But you as a teacher in those schools, are you seeing or developing teachers that are indigenous? Because resources are easily pigeonholed into cash, but your education is quite resourceful, especially in those indigenous contexts. So as part of your work over the last several years, have you been equipping others to be teachers like yourselves so that at which point you kick the bucket or choose to go home, you can keep going?
Right.
So
Thank you.
create dependency in the same fashion.
Yeah, that's great. He's asking whether in the schools in which I'm working, I'm also enabling others to continue the role that I'm filling, so that when I kick the bucket, they carry on, which is a very good question. I'm talking about 3 schools, one of one ilk and 2 of another. Now, the one school I'm involved in, as I say, works on an American kind of basis, and there are African people being given opportunity to further study so they can teach there. Okay. Now, if I move to the other schools, in which you work in local languages and move around by bicycle and so forth, yes, we have various means by which we are trying to help indigenous people to be teachers and to continue that role. Now, a young African man faces a very difficult dilemma when in his life he has to choose. Am I going to work in my language with my own local people, on foot or by bicycle, to teach people what is meaningful about God to them in this context? Or am I going to concentrate on learning English and try to get a position in an international theological college, at which I will get a scholarship for 4 years, and I will live and eat there for free, and I will learn a lot of things that will enable me to talk to Americans and Brits, and get a certificate that in the end can give me a salary that will be way above what I could get in my home village. So for the African people, it's a very difficult choice, and that's in a sense the dilemma we're facing in our Indigenous program. The people who we get are those who have families, they have farms, they're committed, they're in that area. But those who would be teachers very often move into the other sector and into the English-speaking theological education sector, which has wonderful prospects in worldly speaking. And again, I'm not saying God isn't there, which are just way out off the scale of what we can offer. So to be working, as I started by saying, in the international sector where you're moving towards America, moving towards Britain, is much more lucrative than working such a way as to assist one's own people look at their deep problems through the light of God's Word. Yeah.
You spoke a lot about learning the local language and how important that is. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience of learning the local indigenous languages?
Right. She asked about learning indigenous languages. I probably did say learning. What I like to say, using the indigenous language. Because I think there's a tendency in mission organizations to say you must learn the language, and someone spends perhaps a year learning the language, and then when the important work happens, they use English. Now, you could probably accuse me of the same. What's important work? It's hard to get out of English. But we're talking about using the language you've learned. In terms of language learning method, I guess everybody's different. I mean, I set 3 months apart to concentrate on that. I've been helped always by a book that enables me to get the grammar. I work through the book repeatedly, often with an indigenous person to help. And then in the course of life, use that language interaction with different people. And then the more you use it, gradually it comes home. Okay, does that answer your question? Thank you. Yes?
When we find that there are locals who are able to teach as good or better than us on whatever it is that we feel that we were sent there to teach, what should our role be then?
Right. I would say that the underlying motive for a missionary should be love. So if you go to a people, you go because you love them. Now, love is a big, wide word, how are you going to interpret it? Okay, that's another discussion. Look at a parent and a child. The child knows this parent will love me all of my life, all of their life. Usually the parent dies first. Now there's been a tendency in missionary practice to love the people as long as they cooperate with your project. If your project fails, of course you go. And then local people realize that you came to do this project for whatever it's going to benefit you for, and if the project doesn't work, you'll go. Did you love the people? Or did you love the project? Were you trying to succeed? So in terms of the Bible teaching, I mean, I guess many Kenyans teach much better than I do, because they have a grasp of all that culture and the language. Okay, I'm getting the language, but I still use the Luo like a Brit. You know, I engage with people like a British person, and it passes them by. But I believe God has called me there to teach His Word, and as long as a few people come to the class, I would like to continue doing that as long as I'm strong enough to do so. So yeah, they can do better than I can. That's why I say the primary thing we have to share is our faith. And faith is about love and commitment and sacrifice, so keep giving yourself to the people wherever an opportunity arises. And if one means of work fails or falls through, find another way of serving the same people. Right? Yes?
You said, one of the first things that you said was that Eastern does development, but I'm a missionary. I was just wondering, do you think those two concepts can be married together? And second, if they can be, what would be the role of the missionary development person to come to a community without looking like the donor or the benefactor or benefactors?
Right, I believe they are very much related in many ways, and they've been brought together because what was once more of a missionary community, since maybe the 1940s and 50s, development has become such a big thing, and missionaries have become a part of it, and it's all kind of been integrated together. I also believe that scriptural teaching is holistic. It's about giving people, I say the good life, I don't know how I understand that, a good life in God. Now if I take an example, a big issue that we have in Africa is envy. And as I said, envy relates to witchcraft. And envy prevents a lot of things from advancing. How are you going to overcome envy? Maybe I'm Todd, isn't it? Yeah. I'm really envious of Todd. His car, I want his car, he's such a nice car, he has such a nice house, he has such a nice family, and he's so envious that I want to kill him. How am I going to overcome that envy? Value God. Look to eternity. Okay, in this world, I'm a pretty poor fella, not getting on very well. Todd's doing fine. But I'm not troubled by that because I'm looking forward to the next world. So even if he's the person who everybody likes and he has a lot of money, and I don't, I'm going to serve God because I have a wider perspective than just where I am now. So in that kind of respect, the gospel speaks absolutely into development. And I mean, it would be my own position to say that now if I say the only, okay, you can qualify in different ways. The legitimate basis on which to move to people of a foreign culture is your faith in God. And I would say that's the only legitimate basis. And let other things come from that, but not the other way around. So you can chew on that and throw it out if you like. Yes?
I'm kind of confused with the model you introduce or that you carry on to do mission or mission work in Kenya. I'm from Liberia. I have worked with missionaries from SIM, where you came from, I work with missionaries. But the model they carry at the time I was there, which of course may not necessarily have to be the same way. My confusion comes in the area that you get into the community and you see the need and you think the need is there for development, and your focus is if you are to give, there will be more need for giving. So as a result, you just want to work with what they have and not improve on what they have. So I'm kind of a little confused, because the comparison I'm making with the missionary back in the days that I said I worked with before, they build hospitals and they build schools and they sponsor people to travel and go through education process and work back home and improve on what they had before. Why did they destroy that in Africa? The more you give, the more they're going to want. It's simply because people are given the impression that, like you said from the beginning, if you appear into the village, you give the impression to the people that you have the money and you have the money to spend. Of course, they're going to come to you to spend the money. But if you also give the other side the impression that you have the money, but you want to spend this money for a development purpose, and you only want to see committed people to work with you, of course you're going to get people to do that. And while so many of the missionaries live in villages and were able to do improvement in the villages, instead we're able to expand on knowledge. So my confusion is, how can you live there for 20 or 25 years in mission, and yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, you still live in a place where there's no light and there's no water? I don't understand that.
Thank you. The question was, how can a missionary who presumably has access to resources if they wanted them, live in a place and not be preoccupied in handing out those resources? Which is a question that I think many African people would ask, because they see the value of Brits and Americans in the money that they bring. And sometimes it's been said very plainly, very straightforwardly to me, a missionary without money is of no value to us. What value is a missionary from the West if they have no money to give out? That's where we in the West have brought ourselves to. They don't, on that basis, value our love, our hearts, our fellowship. It's the money. And this has been so deeply ingrained into people that it's very hard to get it out. The value that, well, many African people see in the gospel is prosperity. We know the prosperity gospel is extremely widespread. And in my home area, I think it's there. And if you take the prosperity out of your preaching, then people don't see why they should listen to your preaching. If you're just going to say maybe you should live a better life or you should not marry a second wife, woo. People want to hear messages of prosperity. I believe the gospel of Jesus Christ is more than that, and that we can learn from one another, particularly by looking at the faith of our brother or our sister, and that's the core of gospel work and missionary work. Okay?
I had a question. I don't know whether you would share this assumption, but it seems that there are certain forces outside of all of our control that are sweeping the globe. We can call them globalization if we wish. In a sense, require people to begin to interact with cultures on certain bases. English is one, particular kinds of markets. And so the access to resources, the ability to defend oneself legally, all those kinds of things that in essence are implied by, in essence, the westernization of the globe in many ways. And again, I don't know if you share that assumption or not. I know we've seen it in Latin America. I know in certain places of Africa it's occurring as well. Doesn't that then mean that much of what is brought over from the West, including those donor projects, is absolutely necessary in order to enable the people themselves to interact, take advantage of it, and defend themselves from it?
Right. In this day and age of globalization, is not the Western system so closely penetrated to many parts of the world that people need those donor projects, I'm reinterpreting, in order to function in their own communities? And so the best thing the Westerners can do is to help the spreading of the Western system everywhere in the globe. I mean, that's a reinterpretation, which...
The reinterpretation, let's go with it.
Right, which is, which you can see the way I'm reinterpreting it.
You can answer your own question, that's
right. There is enormous need. If you were to come into my home area, we could have 50 people working in my home area, just full-time, transferring American knowledge and money to local people. It is happening. They are doing it. It's called the Millennium Development Project. And my village is one of the target villages. And we have piles of people being paid by international funds to do that. They're building houses for widows, they're improving water supplies, they're building roads, they're improving school systems, they're providing free fertilizer and seed, they're providing, you name it. Now that's one model. I think it's a very faulty model. I mean, if you go to New York and to Columbia University, you'll hear all about it, I'm sure. It's helping millions of people to be more and more dependent on the West. And our foundation is now spreading its impact all around the globe, the Western Foundation. Are we going to also help people to build their foundation? Or is the future of the globe just dependence on the West and what it does and how it does it? Now, I believe there's a place for a missionary to go to the local man and to say, I want to walk alongside you. Not, because I come from Britain, I know all the things that you need to know in order to get on, and I'm going to utilize my Britishness to make sure that I'm always the one in the know, and you're always the one benefiting from me. So then you're spreading a model that the local people will never be able to imitate. And in fact, you're always keeping them down. But if you can move alongside people and from their position enable what they can do, then you may be enabling people to do something for themselves that I've said already in different words. So again, we're not saying that people shouldn't be doing that. I mean, great, let them do it. What we're proposing is that there be some people who, in that sense, move across and say, well, I want to work and live and relate to local people, basically in the way local people live and work and relate.
Time for 2 more questions.
I understand the need to reevaluate the donor recipient relationship and the faultiness in the way it works most of the time. But what do you recommend? What is a way to inject, not bringing Western knowledge,
right,
Western ideals and Western culture into the situation, but to bring water so people stop dying of diseases, or to bring mosquito nets so they're not dying of malaria, or bring
right,
meds to cover, to fix some of the malaria. What do you propose as a way to do that, which doesn't damage,
right,
it doesn't enable the damages that the current existing donor-recipient relationship?
Right, so as I hear that question, how do you propose that resources be used, such as mosquito nets or water supply systems, in a way that doesn't do damage to the communities being reached? That's a question that I think people are really struggling with. And really what I'm proposing, or we're proposing, is, okay, let people struggle with that question, and let's try doing something that is off resources. The British, and I guess the Americans, feel guilty that they have so much. And it strikes me how often someone from the West comes to Africa, and even within minutes, they have money, they must give it. Is that Christianity? Is that what Jesus did? Is that what's really important to us? Or is Christ the most important to us? I don't know easy ways of distributing resources. I'm proposing that some people leave the resource distribution to others in order to move with people, love people, spread the gospel, and perhaps, let's say 15 vulnerable missionaries went from Eastern University to Africa next year and spent 15 years there, and in 50 years' time, 3 are dead, maybe 12 are still alive, they come back, and you have a conference here, and a seminar, and you work those people who know on the inside, but yet can communicate back to America because they're Native Americans, how can one go forward? Now, my suspicion would be that those 15 vulnerable missionaries would say, we need more vulnerable missionaries. Yes? Now, at the moment, where are they? I don't know anyone from the West who works in Africa other than with foreign languages and foreign resources. Now, I only do it for one ministry or two ministries. I'm not, as you see, I keep the children with foreign money. I work in the American college. But for these ministries, I'm trying to work with local resources and local languages. I don't see other people doing it. So we're not moving alongside the African people. We're not understanding as they're understanding, and therefore we're not able to be a better Christian witness than a top-down one.
But
Those are
kind of just playing on that, you talked about the children that you're keeping. And you say, where is that money coming from? I mean, how are you taking care of those kids?
right. I mean, he's asking about the children that I've mentioned. I'm sent from the UK, supported by UK churches, on a level that we've found from SIM a single male missionary in Africa ought to get. Okay? Now, I live in a village, so my rent is very low, and I don't have a vehicle. Now, the money that I save by not paying rent and not running a vehicle is essentially the money that I then use to keep those children. Okay? There was a question over here. Yeah.
I appreciate the heart and intention of what you've been sharing, and hope that you feel supported in the years that you've spent being among people. Like, I have an overflowing in my heart for the work that you've done, and I appreciate what you've been saying, and I wonder if there's a way that this translates into an urban context, or if it's limited to a rural context. And kind of on top of that, or maybe dovetailing with that, I feel like the Heart of Vulnerable mission aligns so well with education in terms of religious education or even community health education. But when it comes to like medical missions, or when it comes to law, or political systems, or police force being created for the first time after Civil War, or bringing of peace again after the election trauma in Kenya a few years ago, these kinds of things, it seems like vulnerable mission doesn't necessarily apply in some sectors. Do you feel like it can translate into all realms, or
Right.
is it mostly limited to a rural context, and then in that mostly limited to education, or I'll just say education?
Right. There was a long question with lots of fascinating parts. I'd love to answer all of them, but I don't think I'll be able to. She was asking, does vulnerable mission apply to the urban sector, and how does it fit in the context in which, for example, police forces need to be developed in southern Sudan? In other words, how does it fit in a context in which the West is controlling and imposing, maybe not in a bad way, imposition is not always bad, systems that will help the people? But to try and answer the latter question, as I see vulnerable mission, it's about getting alongside the local people, and it's not about bringing systems from the outside that they don't understand, but that they need to go along with. In terms of urban as against rural, I'm primarily rural based. There's constant links between urban and rural, and in a sense, people say about Africa, the urban is rural. In other words, you don't have people living in urban areas like to keep a pig or a cow or sheep, chickens. They have the same kind of continuing mentality. It's not like the break. We don't have the urban areas in Africa in the way that you do in the UK. It's my understanding that this applies in urban areas as much as in rural areas. It's in some ways more difficult to implement because it's harder to learn a language when the languages there's a multitude of languages being mixed in with English and so forth. But I would encourage, say, a missionary in Nairobi, work in Kiswahili. Work in Kiswahili, not in English. And I think personally that would be an enormous help to what they're going to do.
Jim, thank you very much. Will you join me in thanking Jim? really appreciate the challenges that you've put forth to us. I know we'll be discussing this and chewing on it for a long time. Do I have somebody who would volunteer to pray for Jim, his ministry, and for our challenges? And was there something?
Just if I can just give a closing word again, thanks. Again, the sheet if you want to sign up. There's another one here and there's another one on the table there. The articles, as I say, if you want to take one or two with you, please have a look and take them along. There's a lot of material on the web and there's a website you can go to. So thank you very much indeed for the time, and I hope that has been useful.
And one other thing, if somebody would like to go, or if any of you would like to go to lunch with Jim right after this, just let me know, and then we can arrange for that. Would somebody volunteer to pray for Jim and his ministry?
Heavenly Father, we do thank you for Jim and for him coming to us and sharing his heart, sharing his life experience with us, opening our eyes to another way that we may not consider to serve you. And Lord, we thank you for people there that he's been able to minister to, and I'm sure that have been a blessing to him as well. We pray that you'll watch over them and continue to work in their lives, Lord, to build them up in the faith. And may we each take away from this seminar more questions, and may you give us the answers, and may we continue this dialogue, learning from each other, learning the best way that we can serve, and in what capacity. Pray these things, that you would be honored in it all. In Jesus' name.
Amen.